Well, good evening. I was thinking the further away I hold the phone, the younger I look. So I'll try to do this so that I don't scare anybody too badly tonight. Um, Apologize for the get up. I've been out running. And as I was running, I was thinking about you all and what might be of interest to you tonight as we begin the 20th century. The big thing I think I would really emphasize to you all is how important change is in the world as we near the 20th century and really in history in general. Let's face it, history is really examples of choices that people make, right? They're the consequences of the choices that people make. That makes all the history books. But the other thing I think I would really emphasize is history talks an awful lot about how people deal with change. You and I know a little about change over the last 8 months. We know a little bit about an uncertain world. And I would argue that the people, as the 20th century dawns, in some ways are living in a hopeful world, of course, but they're also living in a world that is changing. It's changing rapidly. In 1900, if you were 50 years old, you were born in 1850. I guess that shows I know a little math. But also, let me remind you a couple of things. If you were born in 1850, you were born 16 years before the electric light bulb. You were born 16 years before a thing called a telephone. You were born before automobiles. There are a lot of things that are different in your world in 1900, where it may well seem as if the world is going much faster than you are able to keep up with. I think we know a little something in our modern world about that, don't we? A few thoughts about that era. Up until about 1850, if you wanted a picture of somebody that you loved or of a scenery that was particularly meaningful to you, you, if you had money, would go to a artist and have them paint that husband or wife or boyfriend or girlfriend, that parent, that child. Or they would paint that landscape for you, and it would be about as accurate as possible. Well, those artists went out of business really quick when a new thing called photography came along. Suddenly, I don't need to pay you to give me a perfect rendition of a waterfall. I can take a camera and take a photograph and get a perfect, maybe even more perfect rendition of that waterfall or that loved one than the artist could ever give me at a fraction of the cost. Well, what do you do if you're an artist? So suddenly, artists were about to go out of business. There wouldn't be need for painters anymore until somebody came up with the idea of a new style of art in the 1850s or 60s called Impressionism. So now think about the underlying premise of Impressionism. Impressionism is saying that isn't really what a water lily, Monet's famous painting. That isn't really what a water lily looks like. That's just what my idea, my impression of what a water lily looks like. Suddenly, art is now saying to the world in general, in some sense, things aren't exactly what they look like. They may look different to you than they do to me. Another change, and let me circle back for a second. Let's not forget the great artists of that period, Monet, Manet, and so many others. I would really encourage you to take a little stroll at some and look at some of the great impressionistic art. Vincent van Gogh and the beautiful Starry, Starry Night, or so many others of his works. But again, the underlying premise, things are not what they look like. Whoops, I think I got the phone too close. Anyway, I would also remind you of a couple of other developments. A German, Austrian, I think, psychoanalyst, a guy named Sigmund Freud. You may have heard of him. Freud really puts the world on its end when he says that you and I are really not rational beings. By the way, we, for 200 years since the Enlightenment, believed that we were rational beings, meaning we used reason to govern our thoughts and govern our actions. Freud said, you really aren't rational beings. You're actually irrational beings. You are controlled much more by dreams, by irrational impulses, by irrational thoughts. You're really not rational after all. Okay, so let's go back to Impressionism. That bowl of fruit only looks like a bowl of fruit to me. It may not look like that same bowl of fruit to you. Things aren't what they look like. And then Freud comes along and says, in effect, you aren't what you appear either. You thought you were rational, but you are not. Oh, and let's add one more, because we really haven't but scratched the surface here. About the same time as Impressionism is beginning, 1850s-ish, a biologist named Charles Darwin comes along, and he writes a book called The Origins of Species. Now you have to understand, and it's a little hard to kind of get our mind around it because we live in a much more secular world. In some sense, it is a world that Charles Darwin helped to launch. Pre-Charles Darwin, whether we were practicing Christians or practicing Jewish faith or practicing Islam, it was widely thought and believed by much of that world that the world was created by God, that there was a divine force ruling the universe, that therefore there was a plan, there was a purpose to our lives. In fact, you and I are part of a divine plan. That's what we believe, that's what we taught, that God created us. In fact, male and female created he them. And that we are created in the very image, the very likeness of God, in much the same way that you and I are the likeness of our parents. Our children carry with them a likeness of us. Well, now here comes Charles Darwin bebopping in about 1859 with The Origins of Species. And Darwin says, I don't know that there is a God or there isn't a God, but here's what I think I know. And that is, here's how man became man. Here is how all the species became the various species that they are. And it is through a principle called evolution. So wait a minute. The bowl of fruit isn't what it looks like, according to the Impressionist artists. We are not what we appear to be, according to Freud. And what we believed about the universe being orderly, that there's a divine plan, that there's a purpose to you and I, that we were created in God's image, our origins may not be what we thought either. Now, add all of that together with a fast-changing world, with a world that suddenly almost every square inch of the world has been discovered and explored, that just about every part of the world is spoken for, generally by a European. More on that next week. And things are going much faster. Transportation is going much faster. Barriers and boundaries on the world or in the world don't seem to be as profound as they once were. All of these things are going on. Oh, and by the way, human beings are traveling at much faster rates of speed. Um, Back in the 1810s or 20s, and we were talking about railroads creating trains, and we widely were taught that it would be harmful to a body to go more than 35 miles an hour. I think if you've been on I-25 during rush hour, there are plenty of people who still seem to believe that, by the way, as they don't ever seem to go any faster than 30 or 35. But my point is, everything is speeding up. Ideas are speeding up through mass media, this new thing where we can actually care about public opinion, where we start experimenting with the idea of polling. Nobody asked the American people in the 1860s if they approved or disapproved of the job Abraham Lincoln was doing. Nobody asked in the 1860s whether they were for or against emancipation or for or against the Civil War. There was no polling. Public opinion didn't count for anything. The only time public opinion figured into anything was on Election Day. But now, as we enter into the 20th century, public opinion is going to matter. Mass media is going to matter. A dissemination of ideas quicker and faster and louder. Kind of sounds like today in some ways with social media, doesn't it? Well, anyway, all of these things, I would have to think, would have to create, in some ways, a sense of hope, but also a kind of a profound sense of unease. Don't you think? Well, okay, enough for now. But a couple of things, just housekeeping. Do me a favor, take a look at the syllabus, take a look at the calendar, first week, what needs to be in by Sunday. I'll be opening up drop boxes tomorrow for any writing that needs to come in. Your quiz will be open and available to you Friday morning at 7 a.m. You'll have the entire weekend to work on it, to answer the questions using any means at your disposal. I think that's about all for now. By the way, I've also enjoyed meeting so many of you this week through FaceTime. Please, if you haven't made an appointment, let's get that done. I'd love to meet you. I'd love to find out about you and pledge to you my support and my help in helping you be successful this year through these very weird times. Oh yeah, much like the weird times in 1900. Have a good night, you guys. We'll be talking to you. Bye.